I am very excited about the opportunity to introduce our next speaker and the topic. I have been part of about 100 different cases, resolutions, incidents regarding a variety of things, including sexual misconduct, and been part of several mediations that Just Peace has done, and was walking with the accused. This is a very, very powerful tool. And I know that oftentimes people say, oh, it costs so much, it takes so much effort and time. I will tell you the effort and time it saves is incredible, and the process will be helpful whether resolution happens or not. There's something sacred about this process. So I hope you will listen and consider, and I'm going to get my glasses on so I can say all the good things about Reverend Stephanie Hixon, Executive Director of Just Peace Center for Mediation and Conflict Transformation in the United Methodist Church. She is an ordained elder in the Susquehanna Annual Conference and previously served as General Secretary for the General Commission on the Status Enrolled Women. She is, now I'm not going to read, she's phenomenal. It is awesome to be here, and they let me escape from the other track to come down to listen, so I'm very happy.
Thank you, Bob. Wow, what a generous introduction. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Wow. And I'll get myself started here. Let me just say that I'm deeply honored to be able to be a part of this. There are a few more chairs, and the handouts are here in the middle. So that's my chair, but my pack can be moved, Bill, and I can move it up here if we need to have some room. So there's some folks in the back here, and so make yourselves at home. So thank you for being here, and again, thank you for that very generous introduction. You can tell we've been around each other for a while, I think. So it's a deep honor for me to be here and to be engaged in this conversation with you, which I think, as you can probably tell by the title I've chosen, is sometimes and often misunderstood. I might say oftentimes a misused, misinterpreted kind of process. And so I want to live in that tension with us together and really explore, go back in history a little bit and give you some depth of my understanding from Just Peace and from my experience both with COSRO and with being a facilitator with Just Peace, what just resolution is, outcome and process. And look forward to talking with you about that. There are going to be various times during the presentation and conversation that I'll have around the material that I will invite you into some conversation as well. But please, as we've done before, don't hesitate to raise your hand, ask a question. I may ask you to hold something if I feel like there's some content coming that would better address it more fully. So I may not answer the question directly at the moment, if that makes sense. There's a couple more chairs up here. My backpack doesn't need a chair, so it can be moved. Yeah. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Loving God, here we are. It's Friday afternoon, the last workshop of the day anyway. We're grateful for your continued presence with us. And as we begin conversation about this important aspect of our process and our witness as a church called Just Resolution, we invite your continued strength, wisdom, and courage to be in good conversation, because we know that your embrace is wide enough strong enough and tender enough to carry whatever conversations need to emerge in the next minutes we have together. We give you thanks and praise. In Christ's name, amen. Just resolution, outcome versus process. Let me just start by saying this. Everything we are called to do as a church and be as a church is not contained in this book. At the same time, this book represents a very strong witness to the best of who we are called to be as a church. So, this term, just resolution, how many have heard of it before? All right. I'm going to start focusing on, thank you, you got it? Here, I'll actually give you this one, Bishop. That's the full copy. Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to start with the primary paragraphs where we learn about just resolution, which is in paragraph 362 and paragraph 362.1. I've also referenced where it's at in the judicial paragraphs. But the review of a clergy person when there has been an allegation of betrayal of trust has as its primary purpose a just resolution of any violations of this sacred trust, in the hope that God's work of justice, reconciliation, and healing may be realized in the body of Christ. A just resolution, a noun, is one that focuses on repairing harm to people and communities, achieving real accountability, making things right insofar as possible, and bringing healing to parties. We're going to review that. So the hope, and I know that this language was written very carefully. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. The hope is that God's work of justice, reconciliation, and healing may be realized in the body of Christ. And so just as the book of discipline doesn't contain all that we're called to do and be as a church, the complaint process, Committee on Investigation and Trials does not contain everything that may lead to God's work of justice, reconciliation, and healing that may be realized in the body of Christ. And it certainly doesn't contain, nor can it necessarily deliver. That's an important thing, I think, for us to keep in mind. Outcome versus process. We use the term, the vocabulary, just resolution, to refer to both, do we not? Yeah. So it can get kind of confusing, I think. So, that paragraph that I just referenced in 362.1c says, just resolution. The supervisory response may include a process that seeks a noun, just resolution, right? In which parties are assisted by a trained, impartial third-party facilitator, mediator, in reaching an agreement, which is often what we refer to as the just resolution, is it not? Yeah. A just resolution in judicial proceedings, it refers to processes that seek a just resolution. These are just resolution processes often that seek a just resolution, and they're encouraged at any time throughout the process. So, I've titled this slide, A Learner's Perspective. I'm the learner. On just resolution, restorative justice, and the complaint procedures. When I was privileged to be nominated and elected to be a member of the General Secretariat of the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women, within a few months, one of the first things that I did was watch with a number of my sisters the hearings of Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. Those of you might remember who have been involved in a variety of kinds of concerns around violence against women, sexual harassment, assault, etc., that it was during that time that the church was really I think, beginning to emerge in its awareness of misconduct, sexual misconduct by clergy especially, and religious professionals, along with a deeper understanding of sexual harassment and sexual abuse. So my involvement in the just resolution concept and the just resolution principles actually began with my experience with being an advocate for mostly adult women, but not entirely, but mostly adult women who had experienced harm by a clergy person or religious professional within our United Methodist Church. So, at the time, one of my experiences was that we had a process in the discipline at the time in the complaint procedures which very much mirrored our secular court systems, in which the church would pretty much take over the process right away and move it forward. And the person who had experienced the harm had little or nothing to do with it unless they were called as a witness at some point in the process. Some of you are shaking your heads. You're aware of that reality. And so I was, as a listener and an advocate, aware that people were being harmed again. They were being frustrated by the church's response sometimes. And we didn't have the tools as a church to be able to do what a lot of us wanted to do. So the Council of Bishops convened a task force on fair process. And it was out of that task force, persons from the General Board of Higher Education Ministry, persons from COSRO, those who were support persons for the accused, those who were advocates and support persons for those who had been victimized, many other, legal folks, etc. And so it was a multidisciplinary kind of team to look at how could we do this better as a church? How could we be church in a better way in response to some of these realities? At the same time, during that time frame, was an emergence and an awareness of restorative justice practices, particularly in cases where there was crime and in secular realities. So there was attention to harm in some of those restorative justice practices. There was also beginning to be a lot more use or utilization, one might say, of facilitated processes, mediation. What's listed here is ADR, which is a shorthand for alternative dispute resolution, was emerging in the legal field. Some of us were beginning to become a little bit more aware of the impact of traumagenic events, so becoming trauma aware and informed. And the reality that our book of discipline was not necessarily that which allowed for support and healing resources within and surrounding an event or an incident, because oftentimes there were congregations that were severely disrupted and impacted. There were families of the primary parties, persons involved, where there was very little attention, or at least we didn't have the structure and kind of resources to provide that attention. And so, in 2004, there was a pretty big remake of what's in the Book of Discipline. The early foundations, and this is in some historic material you can find on our website around that task force, is really around biblical grounding. What the bishops said quite clearly during the task force was, why should we pattern our life after the secular processes? We should be paying attention to our own call and our own sense of justice and what it means to process these things. So biblical grounding, right relationship with God, self, and community. The recognition that we do have this book of discipline, which is both, I would say, law and covenant. Restorative justice principles, harm, accountability, healing in community. And the earliest disciplines, you may be interested to know, really patterned themselves after Matthew 18, if you were to look at complaint processes. Prior to the 2004 Book of Discipline, these particular paragraphs in the social principles were there in 2000, and they're still here today. They've been reaffirmed by general conferences. This is about criminal and restorative justice. As I said, the restorative justice principles really emerged in that context. But in the love of Christ, who came to save those who were lost and vulnerable, we urge the creation of a genuinely new system for the care and restoration of victims, offenders, criminal justice officials, and the community as a whole. So we're listening to our own words that we've claimed to the world. Restorative justice grows out of biblical authority, which, as I said, emphasizes a right relationship with God, self, and community. And when such relationships are violated or broken through crime, opportunities are created to make things right. And it's through God's transforming power. Restorative justice seeks to repair the damage, right the wrong, and bring healing to all involved, including the victim, the offender, the families, and the community. The church is transformed when it responds to the claims of discipleship by becoming an agent of healing and systemic change. I took all of this very seriously. I know the task force did. I know that a lot of you did and do now. I confess that there's different levels of comfort with restorative justice principles, the whole concept, the idea, certainly with just resolution processes, and particularly when it comes to experiences of sexual misconduct. And with all due respect to Bob's ministry and what you do, I think the effect that Dr. Fried was talking about this afternoon can happen in our church as well, where things are flipped and the attention is only on the accused or the offender at the expense of, sometimes, the one or ones who have been harmed. And I think that's troubled a lot of folks around these kinds of processes and how they've been implemented. And they've been implemented in a variety of different ways. So, let's talk about justice. Retributive justice is something that we're steeped in this, North American Western culture, very much so. And so the questions that are asked in a shorthand kind of way around retributive justice include: what law, rule, or disciplinary provision has been violated? Who did it? Who is to blame? And what punishment do they deserve? In a restorative justice framework, the question begins with harm. Who has been hurt, and what are their needs? Who is obligated to address those needs? And what is the process for making things right and preventing future harms? Another framework I'd like to introduce to you, because I've heard a lot about it from some of you in terms of the questions that you've asked, and I thought it would be a helpful piece for us to also include today. Transformative justice. How many have heard of that before? You have, okay. So transformative justice explores what social circumstances contributed to the harmful behavior. And some people might say social construction of that, because then we look at what structural similarities exist between this incident and others like it. And what measures could prevent future occurrences. This is a macro, big picture systems kind of approach, right? But as you know, sometimes in the absence of looking at those kinds of pieces of justice, it's very hard to walk in a way that God is able to be very clear about God's work of reconciliation and healing in these processes. So my invitation right now is that you turn to a neighbor, and if there are 3 of you that want to talk together instead of 2, that's just fine. But I'd like to remind you of the fact pattern of the dramatic theatrical presentation we had with Pastor John and Sally, Portia and her colleagues, and Wanda, who was the staff person, all right? And those of you who weren't there for that, turn to a neighbor and have them help you with a fact pattern. I won't go into all of that, but it is a sexual misconduct situation. And the question, I'll bring this slide back up, but the question is for you to take a few moments to reflect on this and consider the impact, benefit, and risk of each of these approaches. How do you look at it differently if you ask the questions from that retributive justice framework, or from the restorative justice framework, or the transformative justice framework? I think these are helpful questions to ask before we get into the nitty-gritty of our just resolution process. So I invite you to do that. I'll put this slide back up so you can see the questions. Turn to your neighbors. I'll call us back in a few minutes. So I know you have much more to say. But our time is limited, so I encourage you to continue some conversation about this. But before we move away from it, were there some particular, I hadn't thought about it that way, kinds of responses, or, or, oh no, this is troubling? Any of those kinds of responses, or something else? There's a microphone, right, that we have available, so just let us know if you have something to say to share wisdom with the group. Just curious about your conversations and what you heard from one another. Insights. Wisdom to share with the group. Benefit, risk, impact of these 3 approaches. Thanks.
Well, I brought up one item from our conference that was new to the people I was talking to, and it's under restorative justice and what is the process for making things right and preventing future harms, is that our clergy are required to take an online sexual ethics test every year, and they must do it before annual conference, and it's registered who has taken it and who hasn't, and they have to complete it or else they're not allowed into the clergy session.
Thank you. So I hear that under restorative, that it's making things right and preventing future harms, but I think it's also transformative because it's measures that could prevent future occurrences. Yeah, thank you. Others? Anything in particular about that scenario that you thought about? Some strengths, benefits, impact, weaknesses, risks in either any of these approaches?
For the scenario, that restorative justice worked a lot better because of the questions that we all struggled with in it. Why is the husband bringing the complaint, and who really is the victim here? And so restorative justice works much better in bringing healing to the people and places that need healing. That's what our group thought.
So sort of a multifaceted kind of way to address that. Others? Yes, Bill.
Yeah, I think that in looking at the 3 options, it's not 3 options, but it's 1 option. Basically, this is the 4th time I've sat in this seat at this particular function, and you've got to know what law, rule, or disciplinary provision has been violated in order to proceed ahead. But then the rest of it is how do you make sure it doesn't happen again? And it's not one or the other, it's all together, it seems to me.
All right, thanks. Others? Yes.
Well, we're just really scared that Darvo's going to come in and the building, the capital campaign's going to be blown, and, you know, it was all her fault for enticing him because, gosh, you know, there's no one at home for him, and, you know, how do you counteract that, and blah, blah, blah.
Other insights or wisdom for the group, and then I'll continue on. Well, I hope this is a kind of exercise that you can think about even in a specific scenario, so you can walk through some of the specific sorts of, you know, impact, benefit, risk, and it's not an either or, that's for sure, but I do have a priority that I want us to kind of think about. In our book of discipline, there is actually, in the just resolution process, an emphasis on the principles of just resolution, which are rooted in restorative justice. So the attention is to repairing any harm to people and communities, achieving real accountability by making things right insofar as possible, and bringing healing to all the parties. And it is through a just resolution process which involves an engagement, and I want to be really clear here, direct or indirect. As we said yesterday when Bill Waddell said it for us, there are some situations that absolutely should not be involved or be responded to through a just resolution process. You'll hear this every now and then. It's just reminding me of where we are in the hour. And even when there is a just resolution process, and primarily it's processes that I facilitate are with adults. So that's a clear kind of matter there, although there may be circles of healing and accountability in some other ways. We can talk about that later. But oftentimes they're not always direct either. They're indirect. But there are ways to restory and, you know, get to some of these realities of understanding the harm to people and communities and achieving that real accountability through this kind of facilitated process where voices are carried in a respectful way in that kind of a process. So let's look a little bit at retributive justice and restorative justice by looking at the book of discipline and our language in there. The breach of the sacred trust violates disciplinary provisions and the church. As Bill said, we need to know that. We need to know what provisions we're talking about, what is the covenant and the ethical breach there. But if we begin looking at the process for healing and restoration by understanding that the breach of the sacred trust not only violates a disciplinary provision in the church, but it violates people and relationships. You hear the difference there? It's a very different way to begin the conversation. Violations create guilt, where we talk about guilt, those kinds of things. Violations create obligations. So rather than have a person be mired in guilt, understanding what their responsibility is in the harm that's been inflicted. Justice, the church determines blame and it imposes pain. We might talk about this as, you know, determining if there is a charge and if that charge meets the standard of, you know, saying that yes, this did happen, and then the penalties that come with that. Whereas justice under the restorative framework is that there are stakeholders involved in determining responsibilities and repairing harm. Sometimes, I don't know if you've had this experience, but sometimes I think in our, in the way that we frame some attempts to move toward a just resolution, an outcome, we are setting up two parties to mediate some kind of compromised agreement. That is not the intent of a just resolution process. There may be some pieces of that kind of thing that happens in the midst of the whole, but that is not primarily it. And the church should be in the conversation. That's why there are very specific kinds of provisions about who signs the agreement to enter into a process. And the church is involved, or a representative of the church is involved. So who are the stakeholders, and who's involved in determining the outcomes? The central focus oftentimes in retributive justice is that the offenders get what they deserve. You know, does the penalty meet what the offense was? The central focus in restorative justice is intended to be, what are the needs of the victim, and what's the responsibility of those who have harmed to be on that path of accountability to help meet those needs. It may feel like getting what they deserve. That may feel that way, especially, Bob, to some folks that you've supported in the process, right? But the process of getting there, the questions asked about it are very different around that. So harm, accountability, and engagement are key to our particular processes in the Book of Discipline, whose aim is a just resolution, but whose processes are described as a just resolution and based in restorative justice principles. So when we talk about the needs of those harmed, these are some of the things that often surface. This is not an exhaustive list. It's just something to remind us of some key kinds of components to pay attention to. And remember, we're talking about these just resolution processes specific to sexual misconduct and sexual abuse. All right? Safety. Some relatively close sense of safety in any process. We can never guarantee safety completely, but we can do everything possible to try to create a safe environment and a safe process and a safe space. And that's not just the environs, but it's that indirect contact. It's having the support persons in place and the teams of support persons in place as persons move through the process, so that there's everything that can be offered to try to create a process and environment that's as safe as can be. Being heard, so that the process begins typically with hearing from the person who has a story about being harmed. Restitution and vindication. We've talked about apologies and how you can even say general apologies. Even as a facilitator, when I'm speaking with the complainant or the person bringing the original complaint, the person who has been harmed, victim, if I hear that story and there's deep pain, in my empathy, I will respond. I am so sorry for what you've experienced. That doesn't mean I'm biased or that I've lost my impartiality. That's acknowledging the personhood of the one who is before me. I may also say that same thing to others that I listen to and hear from in the midst of the process. But I won't be afraid to respond with that clear kind of acknowledgement of what a person has said to me. Answers. I skipped over that one, but why does this happen? What happened? those of you who are support persons, and especially bishops and others in the process, can say, this is the kind of thing that should not happen to you in the church. This is who we are as a church, let me tell you about it. And so it often answers their questions, but that's often a typical question. What are you doing, Bishop? Or what's happening in the church? Participation and empowerment. Again, in some of the places where I've been on the edges or experienced, there are just a variety of different ways that people have moved to just resolution outcomes. If the invitation is not there for persons to participate and own their story, as we heard Dr. Fried say earlier this afternoon or this morning, whenever it was, earlier today, that can be disempowering. Participation can be an empowering thing. I have some self-determination in this process. Someone who has been harmed, a victim, should never ever be coerced into participating. It is a choice. And my practice is, typically, I would not want to participate without a team of people around that person. You know, so to utilize the kinds of resources that are in this room. Healing. If in the process, even if it's not a direct encounter with another human being that has harmed me, but in the process, I receive some information that tells me that this person has heard the depth of my pain, that this person has acknowledged the impact of their actions on me in some way, or at least leaning toward that, that can be a very healing thing. Reconnection with community. Oftentimes, persons who've experienced harm in their own congregation are separated from their friends, from the roles that they've had in church. The place where they buried their father is not a place they feel comfortable going back to. The place where they married their spouse is not a place that's welcoming to them. Their children may be pulled out of preschool. The reintegration and reconnection with community is something that can happen through this kind of process. That's a need. And then what they determined is their need. And there may be many other things that you think of. Listing these needs helps define what that outcome's going to read like. All right? And those who have harmed, what are their needs? Knowledge of the harm. Sometimes the depth of the impact of one's behavior is not exactly realized until they are in a kind of conversation with someone like Bob around and maybe a representative from the, bishop's office, the bishop or the bishop's designee, or even me and, a team of persons that are meeting with that person separately. When they hear the story, it may be firsthand, but it may be in a letter, or it may be someone who's communicating on behalf of that person. They may not realize the impact until that kind of process happens. So to be aware of the harm, knowledgeable of it, to cope with their own guilt and conscience, to be seen as a person in context. My experience is also that, similar to what Bishop Schnese said yesterday, what he told his cabinet members when they come on, after they come on, I think is what he said, someone's going to break your heart. The persons who perpetrate harm are often folks who have had a history of very effective ministry, who are friends and colleagues and our own pastors maybe at some point in our lives. So it's important to understand persons in context. That persons have an opportunity to share in decisions about making things right. We can sometimes assume that persons who have perpetrated harm are not willing to take courageous steps to do things, and sometimes they're not. They're mired in deep pain, denial. The time isn't right for them to be able to do that. Reality checks don't seem to set in. Even that friend conversation like Bishop Schneezy was talking about. But sometimes they are ready to do that. And so how can they participate in making things right and being on a path of real accountability that might include their own personal transformation or healing and themselves being reintegrated into community? Now, note what I said there. Not necessarily reintegrated into the clergy covenant, but reintegrated into community. But think about a process similar to the needs of victim survivors and how we might be responsive to that and the kinds of things that might be offered. Think of the kinds of process that rather than receiving credentials and goodbye, that boards of ordained ministry and other kinds of response team persons, et cetera, are helping that person walk through a process of exiting with their family to relocate, not just vocationally, but in so many other ways. And the community. Safety is important. That's why disclosure is a piece of it. Supporting and assisting those harmed. Communities want to do that. Holding those who have perpetrated harm accountable. They want to support and assist those who have perpetrated oftentimes too, but again, with the structure of this kind of process, my experience is involving congregants or congregational leadership in some way with the response team from the beginning helps them to frame this perhaps in some different ways than what might typically happen. Working to repair relationships and reintegrate persons into community, addressing larger systemic issues. What's going on in this environment that we didn't see this, we didn't notice this, we weren't aware of this? Why isn't this just and fair? Why do we call it misconduct? And healing. So at minimum, restorative justice requires that we address victims' harms and needs, hold those who have perpetrated harm accountable to put right those harms, and involve victims, those who have harmed, and communities in the process. In practice, restorative justice takes many forms, but it always involves some kind of direct, indirect engagement. In other words, as a facilitator, I don't write out a resolution and just hand it to somebody and say, okay, you agree? That's not a process. Engagement processes. Assist those who have harmed to communicate with those who have been harmed. And that's specific. Yes, go ahead. Do you mind using the microphone? Sorry to delay your question. Thanks.
On that last slide, you talked about, from the community standpoint, supporting and assisting those harmed. And you mentioned the victim and perpetrator, but the community itself suffers harm, and you're including that as well, right?
It can be, and it may be in a just resolution process. We'll talk a little bit later about the paragraph in the Book of Discipline. There are two paragraphs that refer to the first in the 362 paragraphs that talk about healing, follow up to the supervisory response, and then it's also included in the 2701. So it can happen. It may not always be that the community is as closely involved in a just resolution process or signing an agreement, but there may be an agreement and consultation, oftentimes through the bishop's office, designee, et cetera, with the congregation about the kinds of things that might be helpful for them as a part of healing and making things right.
Thank
Is that
you.
helpful? So engagement processes are intended to assist those who have harmed to communicate with those who have been harmed. And that sounds like a scary thing to a lot of people, but I'm talking about specific to addressing the harm. So if I'm going to receive an apology, if I've been harmed and I'm a victim, I hope that it might be something that I can receive in a way that's healing to me. If I'm in a process where I'm supported, where there's been a lot of attention to my care and safety, and I can take that, process it, have the support to work with that, and have that be a part of my healing journey. It is entirely voluntary for victims. It is guided by a facilitator. Now, I know that there are bishops, district superintendents, and others that often facilitate. I appreciate Bishop Schneese's idea of having a processing team where you have a community of persons who have some specialized skills. Because my experience is, and Bishop, you can speak to this if you want to, but my experience is some bishops are very comfortable and adept in this kind of facilitation, and some are not very comfortable and adept. And I'm not going to ask a bishop to be comfortable if that's not the skill area where they're in. You're shaking your head.
I have a team, and I'm a new bishop, and that was just the wisdom of Bill Waddell when we were in training. And I have realized by allowing the team to thoroughly process, I felt that if I was in the processing, that I could be biased. So I allowed them to do the processing, and then they bring it to me as I would say I'm clean from, and I sit there with it and I work through it with them, but they do all of the processing first.
Bishop Bard, any similar, different?
I did facilitate. Thank you. You know, thankfully, I haven't had to deal with too many of these kinds of cases, but I did sit and facilitate one meeting that with my clergy assistant, and I think that went well. Partly that comes out of my experience of serving on a response team before I was elected. So I have some comfort with that, but I could see situations in which I would not want to be in that role. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. And this is an important piece that some may not always realize how vital it is. That an engagement process may involve substantial pre- and post-work. Bishop Johnson, I didn't ask you about processes, but did you want to say anything about the value of pre- and post-work?
You couldn't say a more true sentence than this extensive work is after care stuff goes on forever. That's why a response team is so important. I just want to say I do most of my cases, but I farm them out when I know I cannot be, and you're the one I go to, because sometimes I just can't touch it for a lot of reasons, and then I use other folks to facilitate. And each case is like a snowflake. They're all different, so we have to handle one case by case.
Thanks. When to engage in a facilitated just resolution process. The first question is the situation appropriate for a process like this? Generally, unless it's a really unusual kind of circle of accountability where there are parents involved and we're trying to work through with mainly adults, I would not agree to enter into a facilitated process with some situation that is involving child abuse or molestation of a child, etc. Now, that being said, there may be other healing processes on the edges that we involved in, but not processing a complaint in that way. And is the situation appropriate? There are other questions here that I've offered. Is the time right? Especially for the victim, the one who's harmed, the courage that it takes to simply bring forth one's story, and then you're asking me to be involved in a process. And I try to be very sensitive about not requiring or asking a person to re-story and re-story and re-story and relive. So just testing out, having some conversation, gently sort of exploring what might be helpful in terms of what their needs are and their hopes are and that kind of thing. And this may not be the right time for this kind of a process for them. Is the respondent willing to participate? And not only for me is it a willingness to participate, but has that person demonstrated the capacity to recognize and acknowledge the harm? Because if they have not, I will not want to subject us to a process where we might inflict further harm on a victim by needing to defend one's story, her or his story, in this kind of a process. Because the person who is accused is not at the place of recognizing. And is the person bringing the original complaint willing to participate? Are all the necessary parties willing to honor the agreement? I want to go up to situation appropriate and time right too. Another piece about is the time right. Has the bishop or bishop's processing team or the designee gathered enough information so that we really do have clarity about what the story is about in the context, and can have some sense of the respondent's response to the information and so forth that's been gathered? Choice of facilitators. And I choose, and we at Just Peace choose, to call these facilitated conversations. I know the Book of Discipline says it can be a trained mediator, but from my perspective, in terms of the restorative justice principles, this is a facilitated conversation. It's not a mediated conversation. I don't want persons to feel as if what we're doing is, again, asking them to give up story, or asking even both parties to feel that what they're doing is coming together as a two-person part of the process, when the process is really much fuller than that. Does that make sense? It is important that people are trained. And it is important that people are impartial. Now, some people might say, well, Stephanie Hixon, she can't facilitate these just resolutions because she was once the General Secretary of COSRO. Sometimes I co-facilitate. And I may have a particular orientation and a sensitivity to understanding. But as a trained facilitator, I'm trained to recognize where my biases may be, just as some of you have talked about that. And then I would make my choice if I cannot manage those biases and be upfront and transparent about that. When I'm a facilitator, people can look me up on the web and they can find out all kinds of things about me. And that's okay. And if folks aren't comfortable, we'll find somebody else or some other persons. That's okay. Co-facilitation can be beneficial. Cultural, racial, ethnic, and gender contexts are valued. I can't overemphasize this enough. Context matters. People's experience and their particular agency matters. Who is interacting with them in a process, in terms of where one experiences one's position vis-a-vis the process and the power in the process matters. When I was trained in alternative dispute resolution, we talked a lot about neutrals. And Bill, I know as an attorney, he may argue this with me a bit. And we sort of try to just kind of, to me, peel away all the interesting textures to think that we somehow can peel away enough that we're just, two persons. And my experience has been context matters. Those textures matter. It doesn't mean that we can't have some clarity about that kind of neutrality and impartiality, but to assume that that we can enter into an equitable and just process without valuing these contexts, I think, will not serve us well. Yes? Do you mind the microphone? Sorry.
It seems to me you've been very intentional not to use the word mediation or negotiation. Could you say something about that?
Sure. I am in terms of setting up the overall process. The overall process is a facilitated process. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't mediation and negotiation techniques that may be utilized in a process. And when I craft an agreement for a facilitated conversation, the title is, it's an agreement for a facilitated conversation, and one of the paragraphs is that in facilitation, a variety of processes will be used, including mediation, and it could be, variety of mediation techniques is usually what I say. So that people do have the expectation that that would happen. But it's not the primary framework, if that makes sense. I think it's important in matters of sexual abuse and misconduct for persons to be trauma-informed and resilience-oriented. What do I mean by that? Trauma-informed, probably folks have heard that term before. You've probably been trained in that sort of thing. We've walked through that a lot in some of our plenaries and some of the other workshops that you've had in terms of just understanding what happens to the soul and the psyche and the physicality of a person when they've experienced some kind of harm or abuse. And resilience-oriented, that's where response teams and support persons are really, really helpful. Those of you who work in psychiatry and psychotherapy and some of those kinds of things, when we try to create an environment where vulnerable persons have the ability to experience resilience, it means that we've set up a system to support them. So I'm oriented that way. I'm not going to enter into a situation without some support around. So how do we help create this space and the time where people can find sacred space, a relatively safe space, recognize interdependence and interconnection, find a sense of equity and respect, live out of a relational covenant, have voice, even the quiet ones, speak and hear what matters for them, share candidly, this is important to me, unencumbered by motions and procedures, experience deep listening and respectful speaking, feel responsible and accountable for interactions and outcomes, and seek to discern together with God's help. The circle is there, and sometimes we do use circle processes. Some of you know circle processes. That's a core piece of just peace. And I often talk about even when there's an indirect communication, I might be doing a shuttle kind of situation where people are in close proximity, or even if we're negotiating some things over the phone or by email, I talk about the principles of a circle process, and I talk about a circle of confidentiality. Sometimes we talk about parameters. I talk about a circle of confidentiality to imply that. So what are the elements of a just resolution process? And you may have some more questions about these as I walk through them. A just resolution process may be used. The just resolution process is addition. It's alternative. It is not the only process in the Book of Discipline. There is a lot that can happen in the supervisory response. Sometimes it's a just resolution process, sometimes not. There is still the right to trial and an entire disciplinary process that's there. The process is rooted in restorative justice principles. The intended outcome of the process is not just a written agreement that's satisfactory to all parties, but a written agreement that addresses harm, accountability, and healing and is satisfactory to all parties. The process is assisted by discipline by trained impartial third-party facilitators or mediators. Prior to the process, a written agreement is created outlining the process, including any agreements on confidentiality. Confidentiality is the one aspect of an agreement to enter into a process that's specified in the Book of Discipline. As a facilitator and a mediator, my experience is that when persons have some choice and self-determination about that agreement to enter into the process, even if it's changing one word, it allows them to begin to invest in the process, and it allows them to imagine themselves in the process when that's described. The process is not an administrative or judicial proceeding. If resolution is achieved, a written statement of resolution, including any terms and conditions, shall be signed by the parties. The parties shall agree on any matters to be disclosed to third parties. Attention to fair process is important, and as we talked about yesterday, those who were in this workshop, this track yesterday, any necessary steps where there may be a change in clergy status you want to pay attention to. This process may begin at any time in the supervisory complaint or trial process. And attention should be given to ensuring that, as we said earlier, cultural, racial, ethnic, and gender contexts are valued throughout the process. What to include in an agreement to engage in a facilitated process. And these are not on your thumb drive yet, but it's my understanding they will be in that group that's being emailed to you. There are some samples for you. A description of the process and reference to appropriate provisions in the Book of Discipline, listing of the participants in the process, the when, where, bless you, the when, where, and the how of engagement. If it's indirect in particular, are we going to meet in person? Are we going to meet in close proximity but in separate places? Are we going to include processes by email and phone communication that are scheduled? Those kinds of things. What's the how of the engagement? The parameters of confidentiality, or the circle of confidentiality, as I mentioned earlier, recognition that it is a non-judicial process. And those of you who are attorneys in the room, I'll appreciate your feedback when you see some of my sample documents, but we try to be really clear to protect what happens in a just resolution process, not being used in some later administrative or judicial process or civil proceeding to the extent possible. But we always state that in an agreement. There's some of the same fact pattern that's going to be there, but we don't want facts that are emerging when you're inviting people to be candid with one another, that if for some reason there isn't an agreement, that are used against them then going forward. So those are the kinds of protections that we try to put in there. Processes for decision making are consensus. I usually invite persons to consensus, which means we don't vote on things. We talk it through. And my rule of consensus is this: can you agree to what is written in the agreement, even if you don't agree with every aspect of the agreement? In other words, can you agree to sign the agreement even though you may not agree with every single word in the way that it's said? A relational covenant is a part of it. We use our circle process covenant primarily and commitments to honor agreements. So here are a few things that are the nitty-gritty technical things to pay attention to as well. Attention to roles and timing of just resolution process. In the supervisory response, it is referral by the bishop. And the bishop and parties must agree with that confidentiality. If it's after a referral of a matter as a judicial complaint from the counsel for the church to the committee on investigation, then it involves the appropriate persons along with the counsel for the church and the counsel for the respondent to initiate that process. If it's within the committee on investigation and their procedures, it involves a recommendation of the counsel for the church and counsel for the respondent and a referral then from the committee to the resident bishop. And in the trials, the presiding officer may refer the matter back to the resident bishop for a process. So there's all those opportunities. There's some sticky wickets in some of these. And some of you may want to ask a few questions about it. Let me get through this one slide and we'll talk about some of those sticky wickets. In practice, I like to talk about a continuum of processes that may seem to be more fully restorative on one end of the continuum or really pseudo or non-restorative. And quite frankly, it can rest anywhere along that continuum, and that's a reality. And I am often very transparent with folks, and especially with those who have been harmed, about what can be expected in a resolution. It's entirely their choice about whether they agree or not to an agreement. But I will acknowledge, it's imperfect. But this is where we are. And I will not extend the process in an unlimited way because I think that's harmful. So if we've got sort of a cutoff and I feel like we've done the best that we can do, then it's really just up to the parties to decide. But it will be on that continuum. It's not going to be a perfect agreement. But does it address harms and causes? Is it victim-oriented? Are those that have perpetrated harm encouraged to take responsibility? Are stakeholder groups involved, those harmed, those who perpetrated harm, community? Is there an opportunity for engagement and participatory decision-making that also gives attention to preventing further harm? And is it respectful to all parties? Now, I want to add this one additional relevant provision. And that's what a gentleman out back here, I can't remember who, somebody was asking about this. There are processes for healing. Follow up to the supervisory response and in 2701 that invite the bishop's designee, process team, whatever, all the different kinds of people that you have surrounding response team and others to be able to do intervention and healing. But note what can happen. The process for healing may include a process of a just resolution which addresses unresolved conflicts. This could be after there's already been through the complaint process and judicial complaint, etc. Support for victims and reconciliation for parties involved. And it can take place at any time during the supervisory complaint or trial process. So there may be those kinds of facilitated processes on the edges. Importance of trained and equipped persons, people like you. Bishop has the ability to call on persons with qualifications and experience in assessment, intervention, or healing. Support persons, response teams, and other specialists. Boards of ordained ministry are important. Facilitators. And here's a piece. It was mentioned earlier. I thought, wow. I'm going to say it again. Infrastructure and financial resources to support processes and proceedings. Sticky wickets, questions. I'm sharing some of my approach, just peace approach, but I want to have some conversation with you. Yeah.
So is it typically just you and the victim and the perpetrator, or do they each have a support person with them?
I always encourage persons to have support persons with them. And sometimes we, depending on what's going on, it may be that the bishop or bishop's designee is in a conversation. It may be that a representative of the board or a congregational member is in the conversation. It varies a lot, depending on what's going on. And even if the bishop isn't sitting in the room, the bishop may be invited in at certain points to have conversation. But I find that it's important to have those support persons minimally. Thanks.
So I noticed you use the word victim a lot. Do you ever use the word survivor?
I do use the word survivor. I chose to use victim here because I was being consistent with some of the language that we're speaking about when it's really that initial first response. And I think a couple of times I might have said victim survivor, but it is important to be respectful of where persons are on their journey and how they understand themselves. Yeah. Louise.
Cross-cultural, non-English speaking, how does that work?
It's important to have a team that can build trust and can facilitate well in that kind of a situation. So sometimes that may involve going to another conference, bringing in resources from elsewhere. So if someone calls me and there are various pieces, then I feel like I am not going to serve that situation well, then I will see what I can seek in terms of getting there. We got a few more minutes. Other questions? In the back there, Stacey.
So when working with those who've been harmed, especially in that pre-work, you mentioned not coercing them, and I agree with that, but I'm also wondering about navigating, how do you work with folks to gently encourage them to move forward or somehow bringing them along in the process without coercing them?
First of all, it's important, thank you for the question. First of all, I think it's important that they have a support person, because it can often be the support person and their awareness of the kind of support that they will have that will enable them to imagine themselves walking through a process like that. And then I will be as transparent but as invitational as possible. I extend the invitation in a variety of ways. I try to understand what the fears are and what barriers might be there. And if it's something that we can address, then we'll try to address it. Thank you. Anybody want to ask me the sticky wickets before we finalize the 2 minutes? Did I invite you to think a little differently about this? Or I know for Bill you said it's probably the same old, but a little differently? Any feet? Yes, go ahead, please. Oh, she's got it. Thank you, Stacey.
I'm a district superintendent. I've been one for 2 years. I'm starting my 3rd year. And so what this has given to me is, I guess, an additional framework. So we do just resolutions in our conference, but not necessarily adding, at least I've not been trained in restorative justice and a just resolution. So to me, it adds a component that we can also hopefully blend into our process.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and it seems to honor the victim more than I think our current process does, and it also offers a way to follow up with the victims or survivor, and it also offers to us, I think, a way to engage the accused more than I would have engaged the accused. Yeah, so thank you. This was helpful.
All right. Well, I think we're about at. Are we at the time, Bob? I thank you for being here, and you know how to reach me. There'll be information. I want to applaud all of you and what you're doing because it means a lot to me.